Alright, hello, welcome in everybody. Welcome to my Final Fantasy series ranking tier list video. This is going to be a video where I rank each of the Final Fantasy games. It's going to be only the mainline games and only the single player games. So this means no Final Fantasy 11 or no Final Fantasy 14. We will not be ranking Final Fantasy 11 or Final Fantasy 14. What this also means is that we will not be ranking the spin-offs, so no ranking like Final Fantasy Mystic Quest or the sequels like Final Fantasy X-2 or Final Fantasy XIII-2. It's only going to be mainline games. Keep in mind this is just my opinion on each game. If you disagree with me on anything, that's totally cool. I'm not here to put one down if you have a different opinion. Everybody has a different opinion. We're just here to talk about the games, have fun. It's just something I'm doing to have fun and rank the games of the series. So the way I'm going to rank it, we're basically going to go from release order. So we're going to start with Final Fantasy 1 and then we're going to go all the way to Final Fantasy 15, the most recently released game of the series. Keep in mind we're doing this towards the end of 2022. We're in July while this video is being recorded, so we're not too far away from the end of 2022. So, keep in mind if you watch this like way in the future when Final Fantasy 16 or other games have been released, keep in mind of when this was uploaded. Okay, so everybody, you'll see here that I rewrote the tiers. So at the top we got God tier. This is the best games of the series in my opinion. Now the best games of the series doesn't mean that any of the games are perfect. These games still have flaws, but they're the best games of the series in my personal opinion. Then we got great, then we got decent, heavily flawed, and then extremely bad. Extremely bad are my least favorite games of the series. In my opinion, they got a lot of problems. They're really unenjoyable. A lot of major issues with those games. So now with that being covered, let's go ahead and let's head right into Final Fantasy 1. So for Final Fantasy 1, I am going to go ahead. I'm going to put it in the great tier. So Final Fantasy 1 is a classic game. It's obviously the game that started the entire series. Final Fantasy 1 is really good because it has a lot of great replay value. You got the job class system in the game where at the beginning of the game you make your party, you choose your classes. And because of that, the game already has replay value because you can play the game with one setup with, one team of people. And then you can do a second playthrough of the game with a completely different group of characters with different classes and everything. Now the problem with Final Fantasy 1 is that it doesn't really have much of a story to it. The later games of the series like 3 and 5 and other games improve the job class system. Other games have some better game balance. There's not much of a story in the game, so that's kind of a missing aspect of the game. And the game is just kind of very basic, but it set the foundation for the entire series. And with the remakes, like the PlayStation Portable remake is really good. It added a bunch of bonus content like the bonus dungeons with the optional bosses. And then the Game Boy Advance remake of it is really good too. Final Fantasy 1 overall is just a really incredibly good game. It's just not like one of the absolute best in my opinion, but it's very strong for a first game of the series. Really, really good game. So a very good first entry. So Final Fantasy 1, I'm going to put in the great tier. And now we're going to move on to Final Fantasy 2 next. Alright guys, so next up we got Final Fantasy 2. I put this in heavily flawed. Final Fantasy 2 is considered a very controversial game of the series. It just changed up a lot of things and not necessarily for the better. So in Final Fantasy 1 you have the traditional leveling system that's in most RPG games. You win battles, you get EXP, you level up, and then your characters get stronger. It makes sense, it's easy to understand. In Final Fantasy 2 though, they experimented a lot and they changed it. So in Final Fantasy 2, when you win a battle, random stacks have a chance to go up depending on what you did in battle. So if you use physical weapons and you do physical attacks, like you attack with swords or axes or whatever, then you have a chance for your strength to go up and to become more proficient at using that weapon. And then you have a chance randomly after the battle for your health to go up, your attack to go up, or if you get attacked in battle, you have a chance for your defense to go up. And there's just a lot of extra busy work in the game. Like, you have to individually level up each spell. So like, let's say you gotta level up the cure spell. You gotta keep using cure over and over again and level it up. And then let's say you want to level up the fire spell. You gotta keep casting that to individually level it up. And then let's say you have a character who for most of the game, they were using swords. But then you find a really good axe or a spear weapon. Then to switch to that weapon, you can switch to it, but your skill in that type of weapon might not be as high. So you might have your sword level at 7 and your axe level is at level 2 for the new axe weapon you got. And then you gotta level up your proficiency with axes and keep using axes and attacking with them in battle. The leveling system they added in Final Fantasy II is not good in my opinion. It makes a lot of the getting stronger in the game very randomized. It's very random. You never really know when your stacks are going to go up for sure. It's a lot of busy work and very tedious because you have to individually level up each of the spells. I think that Final Fantasy II just made a lot of bad changes to the game. And it's definitely a big step back from Final Fantasy I. They got rid of the class system. You now have like story characters. And you can teach them like certain spells and all that stuff. But you don't have like a warrior or a black mage, so that kind of replay value in the game is gone. Final Fantasy II does have some really good stuff about it. The music is really incredible. The roadmap theme is really good. The battle theme is good. The dungeon themes are very good. The music in the game is very, very good. But the new leveling system in the game is very flawed. It adds a lot of extra busy work. It's not very good. The PSP and the GBA remakes make the game easier and they make the leveling a little bit more straightforward and easy. You can fight a lot more normally and not have to do like kind of more like specific stuff to get certain stacks up and all that type of stuff. But you still have to go kind of out of your way at times to get certain stacks to go up or to level up individual spells. And it just adds a lot of tedium, a lot of extra busy work. The new gameplay system, the new way of getting stronger in Final Fantasy II that they experimented with, it was not done very well. It's very heavily flawed. I definitely think Final Fantasy II is one of the weakest entries of the series. Of the original NES trilogy 1, 2, and 3, it's definitely the weakest, in my opinion, the weakest of the NES trilogy. Alright guys, next up we got Final Fantasy III. I'm going to put this in the great tier. So Final Fantasy III, it did a lot of good stuff. You know, it improved the job class system from Final Fantasy I. Now, unlike Final Fantasy I, where you choose your job class at the beginning and the character is stuck in that job class the rest of the game, in Final Fantasy III, you have a lot more customization of your party. So you can have somebody start out as a warrior, and then later in the game, you can change their job class to a black mage, a white mage, a red mage, a summoner, a ninja, a knight. There's a whole bunch of different classes in the game. They added a lot more job classes compared to Final Fantasy I. It really improves a lot over Final Fantasy I. The music in Final Fantasy III is quite good. The battle theme is really good. The boss theme is pretty good. The roadmap theme in the game is really good. I wouldn't say the game has like one of the absolute best Final Fantasy soundtracks, but it's got a pretty good soundtrack. And one thing I really like a lot about Final Fantasy III is towards the end of the game has a very high level of challenge. Like the final few areas of the game are very challenging. I really like the high level of challenge later in the game. I think it's really enjoyable. It's one of the rare RPGs where I was really scared of dying. Where, you know, not just boss fights made me nervous about dying, but even just random battles towards the end of the game made me nervous about dying. The secrets in the game, there's a lot of really cool secrets. The Pixel Remaster is the best version in my opinion. The DS remake, I think, just has too slow of a battle speed, even though it has better balancing and a lot of improvements and bonus content compared to the original NES version. The Pixel Remaster really improves the battle speed. It balances better than the DS remake or the NES original. It still retains a lot of the challenge from the later parts of the NES original towards the end of the game. Overall, a really good old school Final Fantasy game. It's still got some of the problems of the other Final Fantasy games where the balance isn't necessarily the best of some parts. And the game doesn't have much of a story to it. The story is very basic. The soundtrack, I wouldn't say isn't like, it's not one of the strongest in the series, but overall it really did improve the job class system from Final Fantasy 1. The game is a lot of fun to play, and it's just overall a really solid game. So Final Fantasy 3, really good, really great, solid entry, but not one of the absolute best in my opinion. Some of the flaws I would also feel like Final Fantasy 3 had were like certain parts of the game you had to use like the mini status effect to get in like certain areas. There was also certain parts of the game where it felt like the game kind of forced you into using certain job classes, like the Garuda boss fight, where you had to make everybody like a Dragoon and then you had to use the jump command. And in the game with a job class system where you're supposed to experiment, there's supposed to be a lot of freedom in how you play the game, a lot of character customization, party customization. I don't like when in a job class type of system game, they kind of force you to play the game a certain way by making you use a very specific strategy. Again, if it's for like an optional boss, I think that's more acceptable. But for a main story boss like Garuda, where you got to kind of make everybody Dragoon, I felt like that was kind of a flaw with the game. But overall, like I said, Final Fantasy 3 is really good. It's a great, solid entry. It's a really, really good game. So yeah, that's Final Fantasy 3. Next up, Final Fantasy 4. I'm just going to say it right off the bat. Final Fantasy 4 is an amazing game. I'm going to put this in God tier. Final Fantasy 4, it's the first real Final Fantasy game with a really great, amazing storyline. The main character, Cecil, is personally my favorite protagonist of the entire Final Fantasy series. I think he gets excellent character development in the game. He really changes as the game goes on. The game starts off very quick. You get a cool intro to the game where you're flying on the airship with the rest of the Red Wings and the crew and everybody on there. You're introduced to the characters. You learn who they are. You're immediately invested in them. You care about them. The other characters in the story like Rydia, Rosa, Kain, Edge, all great characters. The characters of this game are so good. The battling is so much fun. It's really the first Final Fantasy game where each character had their own unique thing. Like Cecil's the Dark Knight, he gets like the Dark Knight abilities, and then later on he gets his Paladin abilities, and he can cast white magic and can protect allies who get low on health. Kain gets the jump ability because he's a Dragoon. Rosa's like a white mage, she can heal. Rydia gets the spells and then the summons later in the game. And then you get like Yang, who's the monk, and he can punch and he can use the kick ability. The characters in the game give something that each make them unique and distinct. The game also has an incredible soundtrack, one of the best soundtracks of the Final Fantasy series. The soundtrack, the roadmap theme, I think is one of the best, if not the best Final Fantasy roadmap theme of the series. The battle theme is really good. The boss theme is incredible. The area themes, the town themes, all incredibly good in Final Fantasy IV. The soundtrack is outstanding. The game has a pretty decent level of challenge. I wouldn't say it's like all that challenging for the most part, but it does get pretty challenging towards the very end, like the very, very end of the game. But it's at a pretty decent level of challenge at some parts of the game, but it is a little bit on the easier side. But it's still a very fun game, and the important thing that counts is that the game is a lot of fun to play. And Final Fantasy IV absolutely excels and hits it out of the park in that regard. It's a very fun game to play. My only complaints with Final Fantasy IV would be basically that I feel like the story, there's a lot of character deaths in the game. And like the first two character deaths that really happen in the game, it really shocks you and you're like, oh my gosh, it's really horrible. It's really horrible what happened to those characters. I'm really sad. But then when you see like a fourth or fifth time a character dies, it becomes very expected in the game. And it kind of loses the shock and the impact that the first few character deaths really give you in the game. That's kind of the weakness, I would say, of the storyline. But overall, there's not too much bad I can say about it. Overall, really fantastic game. Final Fantasy IV, first God tier game of the series. Alright guys, next up is Final Fantasy V. I'm going to place this in the great tier. So Final Fantasy V, this one brings back the job class system from Final Fantasy III. It improves it even further, it refines it, and it's probably one of the best job class systems of any Final Fantasy game ever. So, basically in the game, like Final Fantasy 3, you get job classes as you go to the different crystals in the game, and then you can switch between job classes at any point whenever you want. And each job class levels up, and each time it levels up, it gets certain abilities that you can transfer over to other job classes and basically combine those abilities and put them on our job classes for really cool, unique, crazy combinations in the game. The job class system adds so much replay value to this game. There's so many different ways to play the game, so many different strategies, setups, party combination, job class combinations, that it's just a ton of fun to experiment and play the game with. Now, all that being said, the battling in the game is very fun. The game is a lot of fun to play. It definitely has a higher level of challenge than Final Fantasy IV for the most part. Even if you use like the more overpowered job classes in the game, there's definitely some bosses in the game who can be very tough to beat, especially on the first playthrough of the game. And the thing is, so as much as I say good about the gameplay, I do feel like there is some major steps back that Final Fantasy V takes. First off, I feel like the story is a massive step back from Final Fantasy IV. The main characters of the game are decent, they are likable, but I don't like them as much as Final Fantasy IV's cast of characters. I feel like Final Fantasy IV had a much better cast of characters, they were far better developed, and Final Fantasy IV just had a better villain, a lot better writing. Final Fantasy V, the main villain's name is Exdeath, which is kind of silly. It's just kind of a really silly name. And the characters I just felt were not as strong as in 4. Another thing with Final Fantasy V, although the soundtrack is quite good in the game, I don't feel like the music is as good as Final Fantasy IV overall. I feel like Final Fantasy IV had better area themes, better town themes, better dungeon themes. Final Fantasy V still has some really incredible songs like Battle on the Big Bridge and a few other songs in the game that are really good too. So that's not to say that the soundtrack of FF5 is bad or anything. It's still really, really good, but it's not as good as FF4's in my opinion. So the main thing, just with Final Fantasy V, is just a weaker story, the weaker soundtrack. The gameplay, it can be very hit and miss at times with the difficulty. It feels like some boss fights you really have to be like 110% prepared. Or if you go into the boss fight with like the wrong setup, then you will get completely destroyed at certain parts of the game. Now, one thing I really like about FF5 is the final boss of the game, who I think is the hardest final boss of any mainline Final Fantasy game. And the final boss really puts everything you've learned about the job class system and the battle system and the character customization to the test. The final boss of this game hits you for super high damage, has a fairly high amount of health, takes many powerful attacks to take down, has many dangerous attacks that inflict very nasty, deadly status effects on you. The final boss fight of this game is very, very challenging. And it's a really cool ultimate final boss fight that kind of really puts your skills to the test. There's also optional bosses in the game, and they're very challenging in this game. Final Fantasy V is a really good game of the series, but it's not one of the absolute best in my opinion. But still a really great game of the series, really good replay value, and still with a pretty good soundtrack and a pretty decent story. So yeah, that's Final Fantasy V in my opinion. Alright, next up we got Final Fantasy VI. I'm putting this in God tier. This is one of my favorite games of the series, no doubt about it. Final Fantasy VI, to me, it really combines like the best parts of Final Fantasy IV and like other Final Fantasy games out there. It's got the aspect of Final Fantasy IV where each character gets their own unique ability. So Locke in the game, he can steal from enemies and get items. Celes can use a runic ability to absorb enemy spells. Edgar gets the tools he can attack with. Sabin gets the Blitz ability. So every character has something that makes him unique. And that's a really good thing. Now, what also Final Fantasy VI has going for it is that it also has a lot more customization than, say, Final Fantasy IV, despite each character getting their own unique thing. because you can teach magic, any spell of magic, to anybody in the game as you get further and further into the game. And the game has that, good combination where every character has their own unique thing, but you can also customize them very heavily and teach them kind of whatever magic spell that you want. So it's got a good amount of character customization. Not only that, but the game has a decent level of challenge throughout most of the game. It definitely has some boss fights that for a first time playthrough, and even for people replaying the game, will definitely be pretty tricky and you can definitely get a game over on. The game has a ton of side content. There is so much side content. The side content is not just to get really cool pieces of equipment or really cool items. It also expands the characters' backstories. You learn more about the characters from the side quest. There's some really cool side quests in the game. And the story in this game is absolutely amazing. The cast of characters are so incredibly good. The cast of characters are so incredibly well developed. The story is so incredibly well written. The heroes are so incredibly interesting. They're so incredibly likable. Like almost all of the characters in this game, you just immediately like them as soon as you meet them. And the villain, the main antagonist, Kefka, is just an absolutely incredible main antagonist. He is like the pure evil antagonist done right. Like in some RPG games, they do the pure evil antagonist who's like really evil. They're not trying to make you like feel sympathetic. There's no tragic backstory to them. It's just he's pure evil, and he does it very well. He does a lot of silly stuff. There's a lot of crazy stuff he does throughout the game, and the game really makes you hate him. You really hate Kefka, the main antagonist, and you want to stop him because of the horrible stuff he does throughout the game. But he also has a very interesting personality that makes you invested in him as a character. The music in the game, outstanding. One of the best Final Fantasy soundtracks of all time. Great battle theme, great boss theme, great dungeon themes, great world map theme, excellent town themes in the game. Everything as far as the music goes is top notch in this game. The soundtrack, absolutely amazing, no doubt about it. And you just got the graphics, like the graphics, even though it's a Super Nintendo game, the way they animated the characters, the expressions on their faces, the way they move during the cutscenes, they're just so incredibly well animated. They express themselves very well. Graphically, it's still it's a game that aged very well graphically. It's just overall a top-notch game. The only thing that I would really say is a weakness with Final Fantasy VI is that at certain points in the game, the party kind of splits up. I'm not too big of a fan of that in RPGs, but those parts of the game are very brief. And then also towards the end of the game, like the very, very end of the game, it kind of gets like into the same strategy where you kind of teach Ultima to everybody at the end of the game and then you spam that. A lot of people will probably bring that flaw up a lot, but it's really not that big of a flaw. It's only something towards the very, very, very end of the game. And most of the game, there's a lot of variety to the gameplay. And you really got the stuff that makes each character stand out. Overall, just an absolutely fantastic game. No doubt about it. God tier Final Fantasy game. One of the best Final Fantasy games ever made. One of the best RPG games ever made. No doubt about it. One of my favorite RPG games ever. Alright guys, next up we got Final Fantasy VII. This is going in the God tier, no doubt about it. Final Fantasy VII, it was the first Final Fantasy game I played. It's one of the most famous Final Fantasy games, if not the most popular. And it definitely deserves its recognition and fame that it gets. Final Fantasy VII has a really great battle system. The combat is very fast in the game. The materia system is a really cool way of customizing your characters. And it allows you to teach so many different abilities to different characters, and it's really straightforward and easy to understand. The music of the game is outstanding. Great battle themes, great boss themes. Probably the best boss theme of the entire Final Fantasy series. Great road map theme, great area themes. Everything is outstanding about the soundtrack. The characters in the game are absolutely exceptional. The characters have incredibly well-written backstories. The characters get great character development. They're very interesting. They're very likable. The game has a ton of side quests, a ton of crazy secrets. It's got optional bosses like Ruby and Emerald Weapon to fight. The game has a pretty decent length to it. It's at least 20 hours usually to beat for a first time playthrough, if not a lot more than that. And Final Fantasy VII definitely deserves a lot of the recognition it gets. It's a really, really well-made game. Now, all that being said, Final Fantasy VII I do think has some flaws. So the first thing is that I feel like Final Fantasy VII, it does go a little bit backwards in terms of the combat. The limit break system is really cool, and that's not a flaw in the game. I think that was a great addition. But when you compare it to like Final Fantasy VI, like in FF6, each character had something that made them unique. Sabin had the blitzes. Terra could cast magic, and then she got the new ability later in the game, which I won't spoil because it's kind of a plot twist, but Edgar got the tools, and then Sabin got the blitz abilities. And then in Final Fantasy VII, everybody's just the same. They're pretty much, they can all attack, they can all use magic, they can all use items. And gone are all the individual stuff from Final Fantasy VI or 4, so there's nothing that really separates the characters for the most part, other than some minor stat differences, and then stuff like Barrett, who can, be placed in the back row with his machine gun weapons, and he can fire in the back and do the same amount of damage as he does in the front row, but have the benefit of taking less damage by being in the back row. So, the lack of character variety, I think, is something that hurts the gameplay a little bit. The game, for the most part, is really, really ridiculously easy. It's definitely easier than Final Fantasy VI, 5, or 4. Not that 6 or 4 were really that difficult. 5 could be pretty decently challenging in some parts, but 7's really it's definitely way too easy at a lot of parts of the game. And I do feel like there's a few parts in the game where kind of like a character will get a major part of their character story well developed, and you learn a lot about them. But then for a large part of the game, you don't learn anything else about them, and it's not for a long time until you learn more about that character. So that is something that I feel is kind of a flaw with the story. Sephiroth is a really great antagonist. The story has a lot of really great, well-written character backstories, really great plot twists. Sephiroth is really good as an antagonist, definitely one of the best Final Fantasy antagonists. Really cool villain, but I do think Kefka is a little bit better of a villain. But Sephiroth definitely does have more depth to his backstory and more motivation kind of to what he does. He's not necessarily pure evil, although he does absolutely horrifically evil, bad stuff in the game. As the game story goes on and you learn more about him and everything. But Final Fantasy VII overall, it's definitely a legendary game. Extremely good Final Fantasy game. It's just, it's got a few flaws here and there, but they're small flaws for the most part. It's still an absolutely outstanding game, and it's definitely one of the best Final Fantasy games ever made, no doubt about it, in my opinion. Oh boy, here we go. We got Final Fantasy VIII here. So Final Fantasy VIII, I'm putting it in the heavily flawed category. Final Fantasy VIII, to me, it experimented a lot, and to me, it just has a lot of flaws with the game. So in the game, the first thing I really dislike about Final Fantasy VIII, I really don't like the level scaling with the enemies. The whole entire point of RPG is for your characters to get more powerful and to be able to defeat enemies. And I feel like the level scaling in that game really kind of kills the point of that, because it basically makes it so that the enemies pretty much keep up with your characters. And it's not done all that well, because enemies really keep up with your characters. And it's hard to feel like a sense of progression from like leveling and that you're getting stronger and everything if enemies are leveling up with you and they're pretty much close to you in stacks. The whole point of RPG is to be able to level up, get stronger, and then go back and fight those enemies that kicked your butt at the beginning of the game, and then destroy them because you've leveled up, you've gotten better equipment, you've gotten better abilities, all that type of stuff. And Final Fantasy VIII, the level scaling really kills that. The story in the game, the main cast of characters are really not that good. The characters are just all kind of okay to mediocre in the game. I didn't really like them all that much. The antagonist in the game, Edea or Ultimecia, they kind of come in towards the end of the game. They're a very generic, evil, uninteresting bad guy. There is some, nuances to them, some complexity, some nuances, I meant to say, to Ultimecia, with her plans and everything, but she's really uninteresting as a villain. She's definitely, nowhere near the level of Sephiroth or Kefka or Golbez or any of those antagonists. Other stuff that really bugs me about the gameplay, the drawing system. So the magic system in the game, you got to go into a battle in Final Fantasy VIII, and you got to draw spells from enemies. So basically, imagine to cast a spell, you have to go in a battle and draw the cure spell. And then you draw the cure spell from enemy and get 5 cures. And then you can cast cure up to 5 times, and then it runs out and you got to get more. But because of this, you really have to be very careful with using magic. And not only that, but you also can take the magic that you draw from enemies and junction into your stacks. And so then what ends up happening is you can get these crazy stat boosts from junctioning magic to your stacks, but then you don't want to use any of the spells, because the more spells you have junctioned to a stat to boost that stat, the more powerful you're going to be. But if you cast it and the amount of that spell you have goes down, your stacks are going to go down. So it's kind of a counterproductive system with the magic, where you're always too scared to use spells, because especially if you got them junctioned and they boost your stacks a while, you don't want to end up using them and then your character's stacks go down. And it also is very repetitive, very boring having to draw the spells in battle, collect the spells, and then junction them to your stacks or use them. I really dislike the drawing system. I think the junctioning it to the stacks is pretty interesting. But another flaw with Final Fantasy VIII, the GF system, it's really cool that you can learn all these abilities from the GFs. I really like the customization of that. But the GFs are just simply way too overpowered for the majority of the game. You can spam them almost every battle for like the first 70% of the game, and they destroy everything, including bosses. And it's just way too repetitive. You just spam the GF, you use it over and over, and that's most of the battles in the game. The characters don't really get anything that really separates them from each other for the most part. They get different limit breaks, but that's about it. So the characters don't really have much that separates them in terms of battles, which is another flaw with this game. Another thing I really dislike is that you don't get money from battles in the game. You gotta take these exams in the game, which are a series of questions, and then you get money delivered to you from that. I really dislike that. I don't like that with weapons in the game. You have to go to a weapon store and you have to craft it by collecting materials from enemies. I've always preferred traditional RPG equipment systems where you find a weapon in a treasure chest, or you go to a weapon store and you just buy it. I've never been a particularly big fan of crafting. I'm not super against it, but it's overall something I dislike a little bit. So I really didn't like that about Final Fantasy VIII. Another thing that is a step back with Final Fantasy VIII, lack of character customization and equipment. You don't get any armor in Final Fantasy VIII, so that is something that I really don't like a lot about Final Fantasy VIII as well. Graphically, the game was top-notch for its time. The opening FMV is incredible at the beginning of the game and the intro. The music in the game is it could be the best Final Fantasy soundtrack of any of the Final Fantasy games. Outstanding battle theme, outstanding boss themes, outstanding area themes, great town themes, great roadmap theme. The soundtrack of this game is very, very good. But the story is just not very well written. The characters are not very well written. The antagonists aren't that great. The plot twists in the game can kind of be really stupid, because you can get so hilariously overpowered in the game. But that's another problem with the game, is how hilariously overpowered you can get in the game, and just literally beat, a boss in the final dungeon in one turn without them being able to attack. Most of the game is just way too easy. It lacks much of a challenge. You're either spamming GFs or you spam limit breaks at the end of the game. Final Fantasy VIII, it's just overall a very heavily flawed entry of the series. For a long time, I would have said it's my least favorite game of the series, but there's another game of the series that I like even less than it nowadays. But I definitely have warmed up slightly more to Final Fantasy VIII as time has gone on, but it's a very flawed game. I have a lot of issues with it personally. If you like Final Fantasy VIII, that's cool. I'm not putting you down. You know, I totally respect your opinion. And if you're really into the game, I'm happy for you. And I wish I could enjoy it as much as you do. But I just personally, there's too many flaws about the game that really bug me about Final Fantasy VIII personally. To me, it's one of the worst games of the series. So Final Fantasy VIII is going in the heavily flawed tier of the tier list. Now, Final Fantasy IX was a major comeback to me after Final Fantasy VIII. FF8, like I just said, I think it's one of the worst games of the series. It had a lot of flaws in my opinion. You know, a lot of really bad gameplay mechanics, a not so great story, but still a really good soundtrack, really good graphics. Final Fantasy IX to me has an excellent cast of characters that are very well written, that I like a lot. You know, it's got Vivi, who's one of the coolest characters ever in a Final Fantasy game. You got Zidane, who's probably the best protagonist of any Final Fantasy game aside from Cecil. You got other great characters in the game like Steiner, like Garnet, like Aiko. There's a lot of really great characters in Final Fantasy IX. The writing in this game is just really, really well done. The characters are so incredibly good. The gameplay went back to traditional leveling. You know, you get EXP from winning battles, you level up, enemies don't scale with you. So, you know, you can get really powerful, come back, and if there was an enemy that kicked your butt at the beginning of the game, you can go level up, get 20 levels, come back, and, you know, kill them in one hit. You know, the way an RPG is supposed to be. It's all about getting more powerful as a character, all about leveling up, getting stronger, getting better abilities, getting better equipment, coming back, defeating enemies. No more only having to craft weapons. You can buy weapons and armor at weapons and armor stores. You can find weapons and armor in dungeons in the game. And, you know, they also brought back the crafting system from Final Fantasy VIII, but they refined it. They made it so that a lot of the materials you can buy from, you know, the item or the weapon stores in the game. They really improved a lot with Final Fantasy IX over Final Fantasy VIII, and they kind of went back to the roots of Final Fantasy. The music in Final Fantasy IX is also absolutely incredible. Another one of the best soundtracks of the series. The battle theme is really good. Boss themes are great. Area themes are really good. Just a really, really outstanding soundtrack in Final Fantasy IX. Really great cast of characters. The graphics were some of the best in a PlayStation 1 game, especially the FMV, the full motion video scenes. In Final Fantasy IX, really, really well done for the time. The main thing with Final Fantasy IX is the battles are good, but is it some of the best battling in the series? And that's where I really start to have like conflicting feelings. So Final Fantasy IX, it kind of goes back to what Final Fantasy IV did, where each character had their own unique thing about them. You know, Zidane, the main character, he's a thief, so he can steal from enemies and bosses to get items. Vivi's a black mage, he can cast spells, that's his unique thing. Steiner gets the knight abilities, the sword art abilities, and then he also gets sword magic he can do with Vivi. Freya gets the abilities that she learns throughout the game. Quina gets her abilities, the blue magic spells she learns from enemies. But the thing is, I feel like Final Fantasy IX, in terms of the characters, it just feels lacking in the character customization. And, you know, the game has an ability system where you learn abilities from pieces of equipment, and you can equip those abilities and they make your character stronger, but many of the abilities in the game don't really change the way you play the game. So, for example, let's say you learn an ability that prevents you from getting hit with the confusion status effect. Okay, so you equip that. That's basically a passive ability. All it does is it makes you not able to be hit with the confusion status effect in battle. Does that change how you play the battles? No, you're still going to use the same attacks. You're still going to use the same healing spells, the same summons, all that type of stuff, the same items. It really doesn't change how you play the battles. And that's really my problem with Final Fantasy IX, is that the battles in the game are good, they're fun, it's classic turn-based, which is good, classic ATB. But the ability system doesn't really change how you play the game. And like Zidane, the main character, for example, for 99% of the game, every random battle, what he did for me was he attacked. There was nothing else I did with him. And you compare that with Final Fantasy 8, 7, 6, 5, where you got all the characters able to do all these different abilities and stuff in battle. And it was every character that could do that. And that level of character customization is just not here in the game. And it feels like the amount of strategies, the amount of customization for the characters and the different ways you can play the game, that aspect is lacking in Final Fantasy IX. It just feels like characters, no matter what, every playthrough of the game, my characters mostly play the same. You know, that character has that rule, that's all they can really do throughout the game. And there's not a whole lot you can do to take them off that path or customize them or anything like that. And again, Final Fantasy IV did it too, but FF4 did it more better in my opinion. Like Zidane, like I said, all he is a thief. He can steal items or attack, that's it in battle. Cecil on 4, the main character, he could use Dark Knight abilities, which was really cool. Or later in the game when he's a paladin, he can heal with his white magic, or he can protect allies when their health gets low. There's just not that kind of cool stuff that each character gets in the game for the most part. Another thing with the battles in Final Fantasy IX, the loading times are a little bit longer than Final Fantasy 8 and 7. The battle speed is a little bit slower, even on the fastest battle speed. The battles still kind of take a little bit long. First off, it takes longer than 7 and 8 to load into battles. Even playing on the Steam version where the loading times are better, it's still noticeable. And the thing is, the battle is like when you go to attack, the character readies their weapon, and then you have to watch them go and attack. And so it's a lot slower in the battle speed than Final Fantasy 7 or 8. And again, the battling in the game is still really good, but the battling just doesn't have the customization or the amount of depth or strategy that like the previous Final Fantasy games have. So really, if you ask me, Final Fantasy IX is a god tier top-notch FF game in music, story, and graphics, but not in gameplay. In gameplay, I probably put in great. And to me, to be in the god tier, the top tier, the absolute highest tier on my tier list, my criteria is the game's got to be good in every regard. So for me, I can't put Final Fantasy IX, even though I believe it's one of the best entries. I'd probably put it at the top of the great tier list. It's almost in God tier. I can't put it in the God tier because of the different gameplay flaws that it has. Again, it has fantastic characters, fantastic soundtrack, outstanding graphics for the time. The battling in the game is still really good, but it's not some of the absolute best in the Final Fantasy series. And I feel like that holds this game back. The majority of the game is also way too easy. I played through this game multiple times, and what I noticed in my most recent playthrough of the game, which was only a few months ago, was that during boss fights, the boss fights only went on for a long time because I would have Zidane during boss fights trying to steal a rare piece of equipment from the boss. If I didn't have Zidane stealing from the boss, most of the bosses would have went down in like 3 minutes max. So that's just another thing with Final Fantasy IX. It's just way too easy for the most part. It does have a really challenging optional boss, a secret boss you can get to, so that is cool. The side quests in the game for the most part weren't as interesting as Final Fantasy VII. There's like 2 cool side quests in the game, which is Ozma, the super boss, and then the Excalibur 2. Those are like the 2 really coolest side quests in the game. But the other ones, they're kind of hit and miss, or they're not really all that special, or they're kind of just like decent, but not anything really amazing in the game. So I felt in the side quest it was a little bit weaker in that regard. I know this is Sakaguchi, the Final Fantasy creator's favorite Final Fantasy, but I just feel like the battling is a little bit weaker than other entries of the series. So it was very tough. I was debating whether to put it in God tier or Great tier, but I'm going to put it at the top of Great tier. We'll put it in the top right there. Alright guys, next game of the series, Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy X I feel very qualified to talk about because I 100% completed this game on the PS3 version. I maxed everybody's Spirit Grids. I beat all the Dark Aeons. I beat all the monsters in the Monster Arena. I beat Penance, the hardest optional boss in the entire game. I got all the Celestial Legendary weapons. I fully upgraded all of them. I did every side quest in the game. I've been in the main story multiple times. So I really can give an in-depth opinion on Final Fantasy X. And Final Fantasy X is going to be the first entry in the series I'm going to put in decent. So Final Fantasy X, the battle system in the game has a really cool aspect with the character switching. But here's where the battle system goes wrong. So in Final Fantasy X, the thing that sucks about battling and leveling up in the game is that you got kind of traditional, leveling up system. You get the money and the EXP from winning battles. But in order to get EXP from battle, a character has to attack or kill an enemy. So because of this, if you have some characters who they're bad against a certain enemy, because certain enemies have certain weaknesses to certain characters, and you have a battle where there's a character who can't really kill an enemy, and they can only maybe hit it and do barely any damage, they'll either get no EXP or almost next to no EXP for that battle. And because of that, you gotta waste extra turns having characters attack an enemy before you kill it, so everybody gets EXP from that enemy. And this is a game where you really gotta level up all the party members in the main story, because there's some boss fights where the boss is really far away and gotta hit them with a magic attack or a ranged physical attack, and you really have to use all your party members. And because of that, the leveling in the game really, really sucks, because you constantly have to switch in characters, constantly have to have everybody hit the enemy before you kill it. And it just makes the battles take longer than they should, and it's very annoying in the game. But the battle system, aside from that, with the overdrive system, with how each character has their own kind of unique Spirit Grid, is all cool. Now the Spirit Grid, it sounds like an interesting system. Like you get customization, can go into other Spirit Grids, but it's an illusion of choice for most of the game. You're mostly stuck on the same path that the character is stuck on from the beginning of the game until you get near the end of the game, and then finally you get the option to go to other characters' Spirit Grids towards the end of the main story. And so everybody kind of goes along their set path, and you really don't get much of an option to go and, really customize the characters the way you want until way later in the game. It's really an illusion of choice. You're mostly just going along the same path that the character starts with until the end of the game. Another problem with Final Fantasy X is some of the worst side quests in any game I've ever played. The dodging 100 lightning bolts for Lulu's ultimate weapon is absolutely god-awful. The Chocobo racing to get Tidus's ultimate weapon upgraded is absolutely horrendous. The controls suck. The minigame sucks. I absolutely hated that side quest. The monster catching arena side quest put me to sleep. You keep having to capture these monsters to unlock more monsters to fight in the arena. It takes forever. It's super boring. The only side quests I really enjoyed in the game were the Dark Aeon fights, the monster arena fights when you fought the enemies in the arena, not catching the monsters but fighting them in the arena. And then the leveling up and the few ultimate weapons that weren't boring to upgrade, and then the ultimate boss fight, optional boss fight Penance. Another thing I really don't like about Final Fantasy X is the super linearity of the game. It has a lot less exploration than previous Final Fantasy games. The weapon and armor system of the game is kind of weird. It's not really a game where you get traditionally more powerful weapons or armor. It's very much about the abilities the weapon or armor gives you. I didn't really like the weapon or armor system too much of Final Fantasy X. But what I think the game does do really well is really great boss fights. The boss fights in the game are a lot more challenging than other Final Fantasy games. You've really got to use certain character strengths. You got to really buff your party with the haste spell, make them go faster. Really heal your characters, make sure you're using the right characters at the right time. The boss fights take a lot of strategy. The story in the game is pretty decent. The characters are pretty likable. There's some really good characters like Oring, for example. But then there's also some really stupid scenes in Final Fantasy X, like when Tidus and Yuna start laughing, and Titus does a silly, stupid laugh, and he starts laughing, and that scene is super cringe and embarrassing, and it's a meme for a reason because it's so stupid. But the story is overall pretty decent, but I wouldn't say it's like one of the best stories in the game, in the Final Fantasy series. It's just a decent story overall. You know, there's some good plot twists along the way, some good character development, but it's not like one of the best character casts or one of the best stories or some of the best writing of the series. Musically, the game is outstanding. One of the best soundtracks of the entire series. Great battle themes, great area themes, great town themes, great boss themes. I believe Masashi Hamauzu, who worked on the Saga Frontier 2 soundtrack, another game made by Square Enix, did a lot of the music in the game. And you can definitely hear his like piano style in this game, and it is very good. He did an outstanding job with the soundtrack. The Aeon system in the game was pretty cool. It was pretty interesting, summoning the Aeons. That was a cool thing in Final Fantasy X. Another thing I really disliked about Final Fantasy X was the Cloister of Trials. Some of the more complicated ones can be a major pain in the butt. They can be very annoying to do. I wasn't too big of a fan of the Cloister of Trials, so that was something I didn't really like too much about Final Fantasy X. Graphically and voice acting wise, you know, that was really far ahead of its time. You know, the voice acting is still okay to this day. It's not like absolutely top notch, but it's pretty decent even to this day. You know, again, Final Fantasy X, if it was the past, I would have probably ranked it higher. But, you know, as someone who's played this game so much and has played it 100% completion, doing all the side quests, being the hardest bosses in the game, playing the game multiple times through the main story, you would think I would have a higher opinion, but it really has, you know, exposed me to a lot of the flaws in Final Fantasy X. And I don't think it's a bad game. It's a decent game, but it's definitely got a fair amount of flaws to it. But it definitely has some really good stuff, like the character switching in battle, the really good boss fights, the really good soundtrack, the story's decent. It's definitely got some cool stuff in the game. But Final Fantasy X, overall, it's a decent entry. It's decent. Alright guys, next entry, because we are skipping Final Fantasy XI because it's an online game, and I said this is only single player games that we're ranking on the tier list here. We're going to be going to Final Fantasy XII, and I'm putting this right in God tier. Final Fantasy XII, I remember being very worried about it when I heard they were going to change some stuff about the battle system. But it's really the same old ATB battle system from previous Final Fantasy games like FF9, 8, 7, 5, 6, 4. The only thing is that the game has a gambit system that's like makes it have the most optimal auto battle of any RPG game out there. So basically, you know, it's still the classic Final Fantasy turn-based combat. You wait for the ATB gauge to fill up, and then your character can choose their command and do what they want. But in the game, you have a gambit system where, like, if a character reaches a certain percent of health, you can automatically heal them. Or if an enemy is weak to a certain spell, you automatically cast it. And what Final Fantasy XII does so incredibly well with its gameplay is that it eliminates a lot of the tedium that's found in a lot of RPG games. In a lot of RPG games, you kind of go through these autopilot battles, these super easy random battles or normal battles against easy enemies, where you just spam the attack button, you spam the same spells or skills, and you kill the enemies really quick. And what the Gambit system does is it just helps you autopilot those fights really easily. You know, it helps you kill those really easy, straightforward enemies very fast, very efficiently. And it's like the most efficient auto battle in an RPG game ever. And to me, you know, a game that reduces the amount of tedium and makes it so that those fights where I don't really need to think and I kind of go through on autopilot and it optimizes that and makes it more efficient is a good thing to me. It's still a classic turn-based, it's still ATB, the gauge fills up all the way. Once the ATB gauge fills up all the way, you can pause the combat at any point to issue a command to somebody, and they'll do it when their ATB gauge fills up. It's still turn-based. One thing I really like about Final Fantasy XII as well is that the game has no transition to a battle screen. You see an enemy in area, you fight them right where you see them. I like that a lot about the exploration and battling in the game. The areas in the game are pretty fairly large. There's a lot to explore. I really like that about the game as well. And Final Fantasy XII, the Zodiac Age, improved Final Fantasy XII by adding a job quest system into the game. You got a ×2 and ×4 speed to make the battles and the exploration and everything in the game go quicker. And it's absolutely amazing. It speeds up the game so much. And it's just an absolutely incredible addition to the Zodiac Age version of Final Fantasy XII. The gameplay is so addicting in this game. The battling is so much fun. The battling is incredible in Final Fantasy XII. The game has a pretty decent level of challenge to it at some points. There's some boss fights where you really have to think your strategy. You'll really have to, heal at the right times, use the right spells. You got to cast like haste. You got to cast like protect. Even, in some cases where your physical attack characters use berserk to boost their attack. Buffs and debuffs are very important in this game. They're very useful. Hitting enemy weaknesses with spells is very important. The battling in the game is absolutely incredible. I love the fighting in Final Fantasy XII. It's so efficient. It's so well done. I just can't believe people dislike the combat in this game. I think what Final Fantasy XII really reveals is that a lot of the normal battles against normal enemies in games can kind of be really autopiloted. And with the Gambit system, which is like a super advanced auto battle system, it really shows how a lot of fights can kind of be just so easily won in RPG games. The side quests are super fun in the game. There's tons of optional bosses, tons of secrets in the game, tons of like ultimate weapons and armors. And the optional bosses are so much fun to fight. The secrets are so cool to find. The gameplay is so good. The story in Final Fantasy XII has a really strong start that immediately hooks you in. There's a great plot twist at the beginning. The characters are pretty likable for the most part. Vaughn, the main character, I think could be a little bit better, but the story is pretty well written. There's a lot of cool political intrigue in the story. There's a lot of cool plot twists, great character development for the characters. The antagonist, Judge Grabomf, I think is one of the best Final Fantasy antagonists ever in the game. He's really, really good. And then you got the main antagonist, Vayne. I would say that's one of the weaknesses of the story. I think the main antagonist, Vayne, was okay, but he could have been a little bit better. I don't think he's like one of the absolute best antagonists. That's maybe kind of the weakness, is the main antagonist and the main protagonist of the game could be a little bit better. Musically, Final Fantasy XII has an outstanding soundtrack, really great town themes, like, Rabanastre, the downtown area of Rabanastre, the Sky City of Bujerba. You've got the area themes like the Giza Plains, which is an incredible theme. You got the Suika Wood, which is a really peaceful, relaxing theme in the game. You got the boss fight theme, which is really incredible. The music has a very distinct orchestrated style of it. I'm normally not that big of a fan of orchestrated music, but I really like the orchestrated soundtrack in FF12. It was very well composed, very well done. Lots of great songs in the game. Very strong, outstanding soundtrack. The voice acting is pretty well done. The setting in the game is really, really cool. There's like medieval setting with like swords and all that stuff and knights and all that, but then you got like flying ships in the sky. The setting in the game is super cool. I mean, there's just so much good stuff I could say about Final Fantasy XII. It's absolutely one of my favorite games of the Final Fantasy series. I feel it's so incredibly underrated. So many people, I think, really just underrate this game. It did so much right. And to me, this is the last real great Final Fantasy game that was ever made. And I think you can kind of see where my opinion's going to go with FF13 and 15 with me making that statement. So, let's get on with it. On to the next game, everybody. And here we go with the start of the fall of Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy 13. Final Fantasy 13 is a very, very flawed game. I actually didn't buy it back at release. I remember I didn't play it till many years after it released. And I had heard very mixed things about it, but I went into it. I tried to enjoy it as much as I could. Final Fantasy 13 does a lot of things wrong. It does a few things good, but it has many, many problems. So Final Fantasy 13, the battle system has a really cool mechanic called Paradigm Shift where you can change job classes right in the middle of a battle. That's really cool, right? It sounds good. Now here's where the battle system screws up big time. You can only control one character in the battle at a time. You have a party of 3 characters, you can only control one at a time. That is terrible. I hate forced AI control in battles. I think that is one of the worst RPG flaws. I really, really dislike that you can only control one character in battle. That's a major flaw of the battle system in FF13. Another flaw of Final Fantasy 13, it's basically a hallway simulator. There's almost no exploration in the game. You run down a linear hallway. It's even more linear than Final Fantasy X. There's barely any exploration. The exploration in the game is just completely missing. It's terrible. It's lacking. That's a major thing in RPGs is exploration. And it's not to be found here. Not only is the exploration really bad and the forced AI in battle is really bad, the story is terribly well written. Very, very terribly written. The story is just terrible in the game. Like, the characters are so poorly written. I hated most of the characters. I think the 2 characters I liked in the game were Lightning and Sazh, and then the rest of them I hated. I hated all the rest of the characters. The main plot of the game is incredibly confusing to understand. It's one of those games where they want you to read an external resource, like you got to go into the lore of the game and read like these entries in the game about the rule of the game and learn all that stuff. And to me, that's poor storytelling. You should be able to understand what's going on in the main story and with the characters by watching the cutscenes of the story. So it's an extremely overly convoluted, complex, unnecessarily so in a way, a very unnecessarily complex in a bad way story. Very hard to understand, very poor writing, mostly unlikable characters. The main antagonists of the game aren't that interesting either. I didn't like them too much for the most part either. The exploration is really bad. The battling has some major problems. The only really good thing Final Fantasy 13 has going for is the paradigm shift mechanic in battles. Some of the battles can be decently challenging, and the graphics and the music are really good. The main battle theme is really incredible. The boss theme is really good. Some of the area themes are really good, and the graphics are absolutely stunning, and the game has a super high production value. But the game just does a ton of stuff wrong. It's very heavily flawed. It is, in my opinion, no doubt about it, one of the worst Final Fantasy games ever made. And it is, for me, the beginning of where Final Fantasy started going downhill in quality severely. Yeah, that's Final Fantasy 13, everybody. Okay, everybody, we are advancing on to the last game now. It's the last game that we got to talk about. The last mainline Final Fantasy game released as of now. Final Fantasy 15, my least favorite entry in the series. We're going to put this in the extremely bad category. So let's talk about why Final Fantasy 15 is where it's at on the tier list in the extremely bad tier. Final Fantasy 15 is just complete garbage from top to bottom. The gameplay of the game, imagine an action RPG game where the combat system was incredibly sluggish, your character moves incredibly slow, the way he dodges is very slow, very unresponsive, the controls don't flow well, the characters and everybody attacks super slow, and not only that, but while you're battling, the camera will get stuck behind a wall or a tree or some bush or something, and then you can't even see the characters because the camera's stuck behind a freaking wall and you can't even see them at all the whole entire battle. Just absolutely terrible. The game has one good battle mechanic too, actually. It has one which is the warp strike, where you warp to somewhere and you can regenerate your MP. And then the other good gameplay mechanic is every once in a while you can do team attacks with your allies. Those were the only two gameplay mechanics that were good in the combat. The movesets for the weapons were terrible. The dodging was terrible, was incredibly unresponsive. The battling was incredibly sluggish, incredibly bad. The battling in the game is super bad. It just doesn't control well, it doesn't flow well, it's very poorly put together. The storytelling in the game is just horrendously bad. The game has a not so likable cast of characters. The characters really just don't come across as very likable. They're not very well developed. There's a major part later in the game where one character goes blind, another guy gets a massive scar on his face. In order to find out how the one guy went blind and the other guy got a scar, you have to play through their DLC chapters to figure that out. These are major things that happen to these characters, and you gotta play through a freaking DLC chapter that you gotta pay for behind a paywall. It's not free DLC, in order to figure out what happened to them. That is unacceptable. That is not acceptable. Not only that, but while the game is mostly open world, the exploration in the vehicle is terrible. You pretty much just stick to one road and that's all you can do is drive in the cargoes. Now, supposedly they updated it to where you can explore more off-road, but for the most part with the car, you just drive on the road. You can't go off-road. You can't drive around like Grand Theft Auto and go where you want. You're just stuck to a road and you ride it to the next destination. Your characters talk about a bunch of boring stuff that you don't care about and you fall asleep because it's boring. Welcome to Final Fantasy 15. I think the most fun I had in this game was the fishing minigame. The fishing minigame was more fun than the exploration. It was more fun than the battling. It was more fun than the story. The only real good thing I can say is that the graphics were really incredible looking. The game had a very high budget production-wise. The music was really good, but the gameplay and story are so awful in this game. So not only is that stuff awful, that the last 20% of the game is completely rushed. Characters who were introduced early in the game and barely got developed just die off without them really getting any kind of resolution or further character development. The game has a bunch of major stuff it just shoves into the story at the last minute, and it just goes towards the end of the game at light speed, and all of a sudden the open world disappears at the very end of the game, and the last 20% of the main story, you're on a super linear path where all you can do is just go forward. The open world part of the game completely goes out of the picture, and it feels like a completely different rushed experience, and it's not that good. It's really not that good. You get to these epic boss fights in the game that look epic, like you'll fight like a giant summon, like you get to Titan. And you think, oh, this is going to be epic. I'm going to be climbing up Titan, slashing him, fighting him, battling him, dodging his attacks. The entire fight, you fight like guards near him. You kill 5 to 10 guards. There's a quick time event. You do the quick time event, you beat Titan and you get him. That's the boss fight. There's no climbing on him. There's no dodging his attacks for the most part. It's incredibly embarrassing. It's incredibly pathetic of a boss fight. This game is just terrible. I mean, it is so freaking bad, guys. It's so bad. It's unacceptable. And this game is so bad that I've told myself I will not buy Final Fantasy 16 at release. I will not buy it even a week after it releases. I will wait for reviews from people that I can trust, that I know who are like-minded like me, and I will wait for them to say it's good before I even consider buying Final Fantasy 16. This is not Final Fantasy. This feels like a random open world game that was rushed and poorly put together, slapped with the Final Fantasy name, and I feel like a lot of the people who defend the flaws of this game defend it because of the power of the name branding and Final Fantasy being on it. If this was an open world game, the same game, but with a different name, I think people would be a lot more critical of it. This game just has too much unacceptable flaws. It's genuinely one of the most disappointing games I've ever played. It feels like a game that is catered towards people who don't care about role-playing games, people who don't care about compelling, well-written characters and stories, people who don't care about RPG elements, turn-based combats, the stuff that people who've been fans of the series forever supported. the turn-based combat, the leveling up with the RPG elements, the in-depth story with the well-written characters. This game is complete garbage, and I hate it. I absolutely hate Final Fantasy 15. If you like the game, I'm not, putting you down as a person or anything. I'm really glad you enjoy it, but this game is complete garbage to me. The character designs in the game are terrible. The characters look like teenagers dressing up to go meet their friends at the mall. It's an absolute joke. These are people who are supposed to be fighting a war, and they're dressing like teenagers going to meet their friends at the mall. This game is a joke. Final Fantasy 15 is complete garbage. So overall, I want to say a big thank you to everybody who watched my video on the Final Fantasy series, ranking Final Fantasy from best to worst. Overall, my top entry is going to be Final Fantasy VI. That is my favorite of the entire series. But I want to say thank you all so much for watching. I really greatly appreciate it, guys. Make sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel. And also give me a follow on my Twitch channel over at twitch.tv/Shockstorm, where I do full playthroughs of RPG games and other types of games as well, and then review them here on the YouTube channel and also make other videos about them as well. Thank you all so much for watching. I really greatly appreciate it. Share your opinions on the Final Fantasy series, and thank you all so much, and I will catch you all in the next video. Have a great day, everybody. Catch you all later. See you in the next video.